I was born into injustice. Any society that takes a child away from its mother when she is perfectly capable of raising that child if surrounded by a supportive and caring community is simply unjust. I learnt very early in life that all injustice is social, that a just society is totally dependent on how we interact with each other as human beings. I was so fortunate to be adopted into and raised by a wonderful family. But like many adopted people, I always felt a little bit like an outsider. And I must have given off the vibes that I really didn't belong and that I was vulnerable and alone because there was all kind of bullies that wanted to confirm my place in the system on the outside. So I escaped school as soon as I possibly could and got work in a shop. One of my jobs was to sweep the footpath every morning outside of the shop. Wayne was a Torres Strait Islander who I'd been friends with at school. And he left school, or escaped school, the same as I did, and he used to catch the bus to his workplace outside of the shop each morning. So as I went out and I swept the footpath, I'd have a chat with my mate, Wayne. That is until one morning, my boss said to me in a very, very disparaging tone, "So, you talk to blackfellas, do you?" From that day on, I waited until Wayne got on the bus before I went out to sweep the path. We all know the feeling, don't we? From those early years in the playground where we're told, if you're friends with her, then you can't be friends with us. Right up to the workplace politics that causes us to keep it to ourselves until we see which way the wind is blowing. So what's going on here? What's at work here is what we call a domination system. All human beings live somehow or other within one, and they normally have 5 categories. The category of culture, of religion, of ethnicity, of sexuality, and of gender. The one that pretty much dominates the world we live in is white, Western, nominally Christian, male, and heterosexual. And for every one of those boxes that you can't tick, you take one step away from justice. Now, I just happen to embody all of those things. But because of my story, I see them from the perspective of an outsider. If we want to live in a more just society, we have to change the system. The system began to change for me the day I was asked to administer the last rites to a man dying of cancer. His sister was there to greet me, and there was a hospital bed set up in his living room. But when I asked if he had a partner, there was an uncomfortable silence. The nominally Christian culture had led the family to be anxious that I might be judgmental of this man's sexuality. And it also led them to put his partner in another room so that he wasn't able to be present in one of the most important moments in their life journey together. Well, this time I wasn't prepared to let the system dominate. I went back to the church and I put up this sign: "Dear Christians, some people are gay, get over it, love God." We'll always live in a society that orders through a system. But when will we be more committed to justice than we are to mere order? When we live in a just society, it will be inclusive of culture, of ethnicity, of sexuality, of spirituality, and of gender. One of the most enduring stories told by that first century Galilean carpenter was the parable of the Good Samaritan. It was told in response to a question, who is my neighbour? You may have heard the story, a story of a man who, when travelling, falls among robbers, and all his goods are taken. He is stripped and beaten and left by the roadside to die. Several people come along and walk by on the other side until a citizen of Samaria happens along. And we are told that this Samaritan has compassion on the man. He binds his wounds. And an innkeeper is enlisted to provide some accommodation. We also know what that feels like, to stand by the side of the road and perhaps to walk by. We understand the conflict that goes on in our hearts and minds and the questions we ask. What happens if I get involved? How much is this going to cost me? Will I have to be committed to this person? What will people say? What will people think? But we often don't quite know where those questions come from or why we ask them. That's what a domination system does. It subtly guides our choices through our need for inclusion in the system, no matter how peripheral we are to that system. The story of the Samaritan is told because the hearers of the story despise the Samaritans. There is no good Samaritan, according to the hearers of this story. So the story is told because it interrupts the otherization. It humanizes the dehumanized. But to tell the truth, the Samaritan hasn't got all that much to lose. He's an outsider anyway. But the innkeeper has. All his customers hate the Samaritan. And yet he lets him stay in his inn, along with the wounded man, and goodness knows where he's been. The innkeeper takes an enormous risk. He risks reputational damage and financial ruin. And this is the genesis of all injustice, because all justice is social. I was once invited to a welcome barbecue for some Syrian refugees. It was out in Western Sydney in the middle of January, and it was in a factory bay. It was so hot and so uncomfortable. Yet they just didn't seem to notice, because they'd found sanctuary and they'd found one another. Bilal was the organiser of this event, and he was a huge man in traditional Muslim attire with a great bushy beard. And he told me this story. He was travelling through outer Western Sydney when he saw a car broken down on the side of the road. And he pulled in behind the car, only to notice that the vehicle was covered in stickers. There was a Southern Cross, there were Australian flags, there was a map of Australia with the message, "We're full, go away," or something to that effect. But undaunted, Bilal pulled in behind the man and offered assistance. He drove him to the petrol station. He bought some petrol. He drove him back. He put it in his car, and he gave him an extra $50 to help him on his way. Bilal took an enormous risk in seeing this man as a neighbour. But there's risk for the stranded motorist as well. And that risk is, will he be able to tell his friends the story of the good other? Will he have the social courage to tell the story for the sake of truth and justice? Who is my neighbour? The answer to that question is disturbing, because the answer to that question is the one that I have excluded, the one that I have marginalised, the one that I have otherised. And we will never live in a better world, we will never live in a more just society until we make friends with that person. The pathway to a just society is simple. Find your neighbour. Know your neighbour. Love your neighbour. It is then and only then we will live in a world where First Nations people are justly recognised, where refugees are welcomed, where banks don't rip people off, where kids don't go to bed hungry or get shot at school, where you get equal pay no matter where you are on the gender spectrum, where you don't get judged for who you fall in love with, where older people are valued for their wisdom, where differently abled people are recognised for the unique contribution they bring to our community. I was born into injustice. Will tomorrow's children be born the same way? Or will we find our social courage? It's up to us, because all justice is social. Thank you.